Thank you very much, Dr. Hill, and thank you very much to the organizers for the very kind invitation. Thank you also for placing me third, because Kent Berridge and Nicole Lavenna have presented you with good data and good ideas, which takes a lot of the heat off me. So I'm going to start with what you've asked for my disclosures. I was previously funded by the Wellcome Trust and GlaxoSmithKline during my PhD. That was an experimental medicine fellowship, and I still hold a Wellcome Trust public engagement grant, and I have had some consultancy fees from GlaxoSmithKline for some of their work. I glorify those as consultancy fees. They paid me to actually put together some computer tasks. Okay. So these are the customary slides to set the context for this sort of discussion and debate. I don't usually present them because somebody ahead of me has usually presented them already. So to avoid repeating that, I'm just going to present this little slide, which is an adaptation of the excellent Foresight report that looked into the causes of obesity. And what we've done is just simplified that very complex figure into this model, which we put in one of our papers. And I present this here because I think it's an interesting way of thinking of the idea of the brain, environment, and obesity. At the center of the Foresight report is energy balance, the idea being that it is energy imbalance that ultimately leads to weight gain or weight loss. And I think you could equally overlay the brain over that red energy balance blob, because all those various factors listed there, those various players, the environment, appetitive control systems, personality, ultimately all of them do have their root in the brain in terms of producing that effect in energy balance. And I just add this little bit there because I think, and this very much mirrors what Nicole's already presented, that it's a very complex picture and food addiction has a specific place in it, but it's not the dominating cause. So I'm mainly going to focus on the human literature because I'm a psychiatrist by background. My research and my clinical practice is entirely, of course, in humans. I'm not a vet, so I wouldn't have the option of doing clinical practice in animals. But there are at least two views. One is that certain foods are addictive and activate brain reward systems like drugs do, and the other is that certain people with obesity show a pattern of overeating that resembles drug addiction or dependence, and the main candidate here is binge eating disorder. And I want to just emphasize here that, again, this is coming from the human perspective. As Nicole and Kent have showed you, actually, in the animal perspective, there's a much more integrated view of looking at the substances and the behaviors, but we don't have that kind of data in the human realm just yet. And if I were just to mirror that with what drug addiction is, certain substances are addictive and activate brain reward systems like foods do, because that's what the idea has been. And certain people show a pattern of overconsumption of drugs that is described as drug addiction or dependence. But of course, in reality, when we think about drug dependence, it's actually the combination of a drug and a susceptible individual over time that results in the development of drug addiction or dependence. And if you look at the data that examine how many people who start using drugs go on to develop dependence, it varies, but it's sort of in the region of about 15% for alcohol, let's say. So about 85% of people use a drug that's known to be addictive but never go on to develop an addiction. And if we were to take the same view with food addiction, which I think we should, it would be arguably the combination of a food or foods with a susceptible individual that over time results in the development of food addiction or dependence. I'd also like to add here that that doesn't necessarily equate to obesity. And I think there is a conflation of food addiction and obesity, and I think food addiction is of interest even if we find people who aren't obese who seem to have this kind of clinical syndrome. Obesity may just well be a consequence of having had food addiction for longer. So this is the evidence that's cited for food addiction. There's the clinical overlap between drug addiction and binge eating or obesity, the familial co-occurrence of obesity, binge eating disorder, and substance use disorders, and then predominantly the neuroscience evidence of foods and drugs acting on the same reward systems, the very good evidence from animal models, which I'm not going to present because you've had experts present that to you already. And then I'm going to focus mainly on the human neuroimaging literature, both PET studies and fMRI. Now, my position is an advantageous one because this is not primarily my area of empirical research, and given that lots of people have done a lot of work on it, I have the advantage of being able to do this kind of thing with the benefit of 100% hindsight. And this is just to pose the question that if we were to start afresh and say if we wanted to consolidate an idea of a food addiction syndrome, how would we define it? How would we go on and explore it? And I've taken what's essentially a very clinical model, which is we'd start with the idea of an addictive agent and an interaction between that addictive agent and a behavioral syndrome. We'd find some way of operationalizing and measuring that syndrome, investigate its neurobiology and its environment, but also, like with any clinical syndrome, we'd be interested in what its natural history and its evolution was, and ultimately we'd be interested in coming up with treatments and developing a comprehensive model. This is great. As I said, this is highly idealized. I would raise this one particular issue because there has been an aspect of the debate which is that perhaps the idea of an addictive food might be optional. And this is where the parallels are drawn with the idea of pathological gambling, with gambling being an addiction syndrome where you don't have a clear pharmacological agent. I don't think that's an option we have here, and I think that's what most people would agree, because we do have a substance that at least does have some psychoactive properties. But of course, this is highly idealized, as I said. This is where we've largely got evidence so far. And of course, if you want to develop this kind of model, what you really need are long-term prospective studies, which we'd ideally like. Of course, what we usually get are cross-sectional studies that give us pointers and similarities and circumstantial evidence to try and build up a picture. And I think this is more a reflection of the fact of the infancy of the field. We haven't just had the time to get around to doing these long-term prospective studies. And I want to just take you through those different elements of that particular diagram. I'm going to focus on the central block. So I think the addictive agent, as Nicole has already described, we've got some pretty good ideas of what the addictive agent might be, and these are easier to operationalize in animal models. I think with human foods and the complexity of human foods, it's much harder. The various ideas that have been raised are high fat, high sugar, and more compellingly, the idea of combinations of high fat and sugar. Salt and refined and processed foods are the other ideas. And I think these are all probably on the right track, but they're all imprecise. When we say high fat, without an actual quantification of high fat, that I think doesn't take us much beyond a value judgment. And I think the value judgment is particularly harder for ideas like refined or processed foods, because what exactly do you mean by that? And the one thing I'm wary of is sort of comparisons that are drawn between drugs and foods. So the example of cocaine is often raised as one where you have a mild stimulant that existed in the coca leaf, which you manage to process and refine to one of the most addictive agents that you know, that's cocaine. And I think if you take that kind of parallel to foods, it can get slightly misleading and very difficult to quantify. The other thing, of course, is in terms of relationship. This is a purely hypothetical graph plotting the potential addictive potential of pizza versus the weight of cheese on it. We're, of course, predominantly dealing with fat, and it may be such a relationship. It could alternatively be such a relationship. And that's, of course, purely hypothetical. But I think the nature of the foods we deal with requires us to actually come up with some cutoff point that we can mark on these graphs, assuming that these graphs are just things that I've completely made up. Now, the next thing is about the actual behavioral syndrome we're talking about. The behavioral syndrome I'm going to focus on is the one that's been described. None of these are my ideas in terms of what the actual syndrome might be. But the syndrome is based on the DSM-4 model. And I'll leave it at DSM-4 and not enter the DSM-5. As a psychiatrist, I suppose like most psychiatrists, I have a healthy skepticism about DSM-4 and ICD-10, essentially because the objects of mental illness, unlike, let's say, the tumors of cancer, aren't very clear-cut. They're what we think of as hybrid objects. There's some element of a neurobiological signal that's transmuted by various social and cultural factors. And then our classification systems are basically listings. We don't actually have a great theoretical basis for categorizing these disorders. We list them in a particular way, and the DSM and other criteria are essentially the currently agreed consensus guidelines for what we think these syndromes are. And I think that's slightly different from them being real things. So these are the DSM-4 criteria for substance dependence. I'm not going to go over them in detail. Nicole's already taken you through them. And I think the substance definitely does matter, because couched in the DSM chapter on substance addiction is all the idea that this applies when you have a substance that you think is psychoactive or addictive in some way. There is another problem with these criteria, which is that they do tend to conflate, I think, what are core aspects of a syndrome with secondary aspects which relate to impairment of functioning or relate to the pharmacological properties. So this is work now from 10 years ago, which I think sort of honed down on this syndrome and picked these three as probably the key core criteria of what signifies addiction. Tolerance and withdrawal depend very much on what kind of drug you're using. Cocaine doesn't cause a very clear withdrawal syndrome. Alcohol is an excellent example for both tolerance and withdrawal. Marijuana is another tricky one when it comes to trying to apply these two criteria. And of course, they also do relate to how long you've taken the substance. You can actually take a fair amount of alcohol before you are getting to a point where you're developing withdrawal syndromes. And the other is, of course, the social and occupational functioning. So I think those are limitations of the DSM-4 criteria. They're sort of made much easier to apply if you have substances to apply them with. These are the proposed food addiction equivalents. This is actually the same graph that, the same table that Nicole presented. These criteria here, again, I can't take any credit. These aren't mine. These are essentially from two papers from 2007 and 2009. One is Nora Volkov's and the other is Ashley Gearhart's. To me, this is interesting that I think in 2007, pretty much the same criteria were proposed to define obesity as a potential brain disorder. 2 years later, exactly the same criteria are applied for food addiction. And I think that sort of points to this conflation of food addiction and obesity. The criteria haven't changed between these two papers at all. And I think there are problems associated with them. It's very easy to point out and say we don't have a clear idea of tolerance and withdrawal. I think that's okay. We probably just haven't had enough time to actually develop that data. However, I think if you do want to apply those criteria to humans, you do need to know what exactly they mean to you. And I think that's important. So this is the Yale Food Addiction Scale. The Yale Food Addiction Scale is based upon the DSM-4 criteria. I've already told you about my skepticism about the DSM-4 criteria, but I think they're a reasonable guide to work with. And a lot of it is a straightforward translation. There is a severity cutoff that the scale is applied, and I think you need to do that because the DSM-4 criteria were never built to deal with a substance that you needed to take. You don't need to take alcohol or cocaine. You can if you want to, but you don't need to, whereas food you need to take. And I think that puts you in the position of needing a severity criteria to separate out what's necessary or within the normal spectrum of requirement to what goes into possible pathology. And there are some of them which are of this Likert severity type, and some of them are dichotomous. And I think it's a reasonable approximation, but as a psychometric instrument, and this is what I think as clinicians we're interested in, we do want to know how valid this instrument is. And it has a challenge, of course, because it's the first of its kind. But the instrument was created by translating the substance use criteria. It used a cutoff of 3 symptoms, plus distress or impairment. And the plus distress or impairment is not part of the DSM criteria for substance use. It's had to be added here because, again, you need to distinguish something that you need to take from something that you don't need to take. The test was originally the scale was originally validated in a predominantly healthy population, predominantly normal weight, and I think that's important. And the preliminary validation, the median count was 1. About 11% qualified for food addiction as per that particular scale. And that correlated very strongly with the eating attitudes test. And I think that's some cause for caution, because the eating attitudes test is the kind of scale that you can give most teenagers, and they would tell you this is about anorexia nervosa and bulimia. It is very on the face an eating disorder scale. So there's a high correlation with what is essentially 2 known eating disorders, which just made the fact that actually a lot of these behaviors overlap and it's difficult to disentangle them. And the scale was discriminated from other measures of alcohol use and impulsivity. And I think that's not exactly a very good distinction of a scale that's measuring very, very different things. The scale was further validated in 2 other samples. And what I just want to emphasize to here is that one is a group of obese subjects, one is a group of people with binge eating disorder, and there's a fairly strong overlap. 72% of the people who had food addiction in the first study also had binge eating disorder, and in the second study, nearly 60% of those with binge eating disorder also had food addiction. So there is a fairly strong overlap between these two clinical syndromes. Of particular concern to me, and this comes back to the point of tolerance and withdrawal, is that in both these studies, these participants endorsed very high rates of tolerance and withdrawal. And again, I think my main problem with that is I think the authors of the scale need to have a fairly clear idea of what tolerance and withdrawal are, because without that, this is just what a respondent says is my idea of tolerance and withdrawal. Now, the scale's gone further. There's a mini version and there's a childhood version, both of which have been validated against this original validation study. And given that the original validation, I think, is slightly problematic, to me, that casts doubts on the validity of the modified versions. Okay? I'm going to very briefly rush through this bit. This is the second point about the shared vulnerability of of obesity and substance use disorders. And it seems to relate to an idea that there's a certain addictive vulnerability which leads some people to substances, other people to foods. And people who give up drugs tend to replace them with foods. This is an idea. I'm not sure that there is very much evidence to support this. I've listed these two studies. I think the evidence is very weak from here because they're self-report studies with very tiny numbers. But I always like emphasizing this aspect of drug addiction from my colleague Karen Ursch's work. And these are two of her papers. In the first paper, she was looking at the siblings of those with drug addiction compared to the probans. And what she found was that both groups, the siblings and the patients, had terrible histories in terms of childhood adversity. So there is a major shared environment component there. And the second is from her study of stimulant users on cocaine. And what she finds is that it looks like these stimulant users have abnormal eating even before they go on to cocaine. But once they come off the cocaine and lose the anorectic effects, they start to put on weight. Okay, so this is where I've taken you through in terms of this little model I proposed. And now to just take you into the neurobiology. And I should say much of the neurobiology is guided by the neuroscience of drug addiction, in which there's been a lot more work over several more years. But I think that does give us the slight concern about a risk of borrowed legitimacy. Just because you find something with food that you find in drugs, it doesn't necessarily give you a very strong parallel to say that therefore food addiction is like drug addiction. It definitely points you in that way, but I think it doesn't change the threshold of evidence you need for food addiction per se. This is the dummy's guide to models of drug addiction. I'm not going to really go into this in detail. I wouldn't dare to with Kent Berridge in the room. I want to emphasize just a couple of points on this, because these are just the ideas that I think have been carried forward from drug addiction to food addiction, and which is essentially, and the key points I want to emphasize is that drug taking starts off as voluntary and goal-directed and gradually becomes compulsive and habitual. Increasingly, the focus shifts from the actual consummation of the drug to the cues that predict that drug. And then the idea that D2 receptors in the striatum fall, and that leads to the development of this reward deficiency syndrome. Now, the idea of foods and drugs acting on overlapping systems, Nicole has already covered, so I'm not going to go into great detail. I want to just briefly present this data from Regina Corelli's lab, where she distinctly shows that there are separate neuronal populations in the accumbens that respond to cocaine and respond to water. And that's not a feature of exposure to cocaine rewards. There seem to be distinct neuronal populations that code these different rewards. Now, the animal model data is the best so far, and I think that tells us clearly there is a syndrome here that we should definitely investigate and characterize in further detail in humans. I'm not going to discuss it because I don't think I have anything to add to what Nicole and Kent have already told you. So I'm going to skip over that and go straight to the human neuroimaging evidence. And here I think there are some key methodological issues. And the first is, what is the phenotype you're studying? The second is, what populations do you study with that phenotype? And what process do you examine? Because the human neuroimaging evidence is always, like all experiments, looking at a specific process, be that consummation, be that anticipation, be that motivation. And then what is the resolution of the methodology you use? And I want to just hark back to Regina Corelli's data, where you have distinct neuronal populations in the accumbens that code for different rewards. With human neuroimaging, we do not have the actual resolution to distinguish neuronal populations. We can barely image the accumbens. reasonably well. But to look within subgroups of the accumbens, I don't think we have that level of resolution. So foods and drugs would presumably activate the same areas in a human neuroimaging study, and that may just be because you cannot look closely enough. And of course, there's the issue of, is what you find correlation or causation? And again, this is a difficulty because in humans, we largely do cross-sectional studies. I want to raise a couple of key conceptual issues, I think, which underlie this. And the first is whether we think there is an addictive aspect to normal eating behavior. And I think this is slightly different from whether addiction lies in a continuum of normal eating behavior. Essentially, my question, if you find a process, is it fundamentally addictive if you were to find it in, let's say, healthy people, to say that this is what happens in people with food addiction? And that's important because a lot of the human neuroimaging has looked at healthy lean and healthy obese people. And if you're going to extrapolate from that finding to food addiction, I think you do enter this murky area of, is this normal process I image fundamentally addictive? So now this is probably the study that kicked it all off big time. This is Nora Volkov and Jack-Jean Wang's paper from 2001, which showed that there were lower D2 receptors in obesity. And this very closely paralleled their studies in patients with methamphetamine and cocaine abuse. And it's an extremely striking finding. This is the same finding depicted in graph form in a later paper. I'm going to just perform a Fletcher transformation on these data, which is I'm going to flip the graph over. I'm going to remove the lines and put the means. And you can see that the means very clearly separate, but there is a lot of overlap between these groups. And I think that's quite telling, given that BMIs in this sample go from 20 to 60. So across a huge range, there's a massive overlap. And the second thing is, if I put the line there that divides the groups, what we're looking at is lean and obese versus morbidly obese. And if I were to move that to where we'd normally put lean versus obese, that's where the data would separate. And you can still see a stepwise pattern across those three categories. But I think that's important to bear when appraising this data. And of course, there is the question of, is this cause or consequence? And certainly in drug addiction, actually the clarification came from animal studies, which showed that lower D2 receptors in the striatum represent a vulnerability factor, especially for stimulant dependence. But if we just explore the history of that particular finding further, there's been one replication which has a slightly different methodology, which I think makes it slightly trickier to appraise. But there have been 5 failures to replicate that finding. 3 are published. 1 was presented at SFN last year, and 1 is a personal communication. And in fact, this graph that I show you below is from another one of Nora Volkov's papers, showing an absolutely opposite finding to the first one. So I don't think lower D2 receptors in obesity is by any means a given. And I think the balance of the data suggests that actually, if anything, it's probably a consequence, and more of the data is against it rather than for it. This is our quick, easy-to-access slide from our paper. It gives you a very clear overview of the functional neuroimaging literature. I haven't particularly updated this, and really the only point I want you to take away from this is that in this graph, in this table, there are arrows that go up, that go down. Essentially, the key message from here is that there isn't a clear mechanism, a clear single mechanism that emerges from the functional imaging of lean and obese individuals to say that there is one single mechanism, let alone an addictive mechanism. And this is where I think the issues about what's the phenotype, what is the process, what is the resolution come into play. There is one study that's looked at food addiction, and this is actually Gerhardt's paper from about 3 years ago. I'm only going to skim over the data here because I think it's important in the first instance to look at the sample, and it's predominantly female normal weight subjects. The critical thing here is that I think there are some key assumptions that underlie interpreting these data. And the first is that you need to accept that the Yale Food Addiction Scale is a valid measure of food addiction and that its symptoms represent a continuum of severity. So having 2 symptoms is worse than having 1 symptom and so on. Because the only findings from this study emerge if you apply that continuum. More importantly for me, I think there are only 2 people in that sample who possibly qualify for a diagnosis of food addiction. So to me, I don't think that paper tells us very much about food addiction because there are these key assumptions that it rests on. The findings per se, if you want to go into them in detail, you actually see a correlation with the severity of the symptom. And here you see effects in different areas that to a great extent, are driven by differences in the perception of the water control in the blue bars rather than by the chocolate milk test. So, in summary, I don't think that there's very good human data for food addiction. And I don't think the argument is about whether there is a food addiction or not. I think there probably well is, and the animal data are very compelling, and I don't think it necessarily needs to be associated with obesity. But before we actually grab hold of the model and apply it to humans, I think there's a responsibility to actually consider the evidence and its implications before we act on it. I have about 20 seconds. I'm just going to go through these possible ways of exploring it further. I think there are some very pragmatic ways, which is to essentially characterize the syndrome more rigorously, or follow up people who currently qualify for food addiction and see, does the diagnosis of food addiction tell you something more about these people in addition to what they already have as binge eating disorder? The more challenging aspect is actually defining a clear syndrome and an agent and establishing its natural history. And I do think we need to consider the realities of how we're going to implement this both in the clinic and in the public health realm. I'll leave you here with this particular line from our paper, which is essentially that you can find it quite hard to think of an illegal cheesecake dealer, but it's much more difficult to consider how you might restrict cheesecakes from some samples of some segments of the population and not from others if you thought they were addictive. Okay, and I think as just a talking point, I'd leave this to really think about what is the purpose of food addiction, because I think the evidence we need depends very much on what we want it for. Thank you very much, and sorry for running over.